Zeynep Tu is an Ottoman historian, working on the conversions of the religious non-conforming communities, including Pontic crypto-Christians, Ezidis, Kızılbaş Alevis, and Nusayri Alevites. She received her PhD at UCLA in 2009 and has held several fellowships. She worked as an assistant professor at Dartmouth College between 2011 and 2016, when she decided to resettle in Turkey. Her hope was to be close to the communities, learn from them, and give back to them with her intellectual production. She is a signatory to the petition by Academics for Peace of 2016. Following the petition's publication, state and higher education authorities in Turkey began launching criminal and administrative investigations against the signatories. Even though Zeynep's case has not been prosecuted, she chose to leave Turkey because, under the current political circumstances, she would not have been able to pursue her academic career. Her research interests covered the long journey from the Ottoman reform movement in 1839 to the early era of the Turkish Republic, which witnessed genocidal policies against Pontic, Ezidis, and Kızılbaş Alevis, both by late Ottoman and Turkish states. Zeynep's research interests challenge both the Kemalist myth and the current government's Islamic agenda, and thus put her in a vulnerable position vis-à-vis both groups. Zeynep Tu is currently in Berlin on a research fellowship at the Academy in Exile and Transregionale Forum Studien in Berlin to study the history and memory of violence and massacre among the Ezidi communities from 17th century under the Ottoman to the last genocidal attack of ISIS. Zeynep, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
You work on the topic of Ezidi refugees. Who are the Yazidis? Why have many Yazidis been forced to leave their homelands?
Yazidis are one of the ancient and old communities of the Middle East. I refer to them usually as a non-conforming community with reference to the established religious traditions. And when I say established religious traditions, what I have in mind is the monotheistic traditions, particularly the Abrahamic ones, that categorize creeds and different belief systems as within their system or outside of their system. And Yazidis definitely fall outside of categorization that has been developed by Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And they've traditionally placed themselves particularly kind of a distant relation to Islam, and that has been a very controversial history between these Muslim communities and Yazidis for a very long time. In terms of what happened most recently, of course, their identity has quite a bit to do with the entire process. Actually, ISIS or Daesh, however you prefer to refer to them, sent a group of young students and asked them to study Yazidis as a creed and decide whether they should be forced to convert, whether they can be enslaved or not, and categorize them according to categories that have been developed in the long history of Islam. And they write in one of their propaganda journals that Yazidis are actually infidels, and their existence is a matter of disgrace, a matter of shame for the Muslims. So they decide to take the issue in their hands. So as you can see, especially reading this journal, writing about this just around the time of the attack in August 2014, you get the sense that their religion, their identity is at the at the core of this last attack on Yazidis. So in terms of besides their religious identity, of course, there's the question of ethnicity that's often raised by different groups. If you ask Yazidis, they are simply Yazidis. Most of them argue that they are actually a separate community altogether. But there are also references to them being Kurdish or Arab. Their religion, their holy books, their liturgies actually in Kurdish. And a lot of them are actually Kurdish speakers, predominantly Kurdish speaking community. But those who are living in Syria and Iraq are also Arabic speakers. So that little bit complicates the story, especially after decades of Arabization policies that targeted these communities. So to sum up, Yazidis are a very old creed that inhabited a highly mountainous region between Iraq, Syria, and today's Turkey. And as a result of a long process of persecution, they established an ethno-religious identity that is very close-knit and that strictly separates those who are inside the tradition from those who are outside.
Is Yazidi refugeeism a new phenomenon?
It's not. Actually, there's a very long history of Yazidi refugeeism, and it's one of those traditions. And I would here be very bold and compare to that to the experiences of, let's say, Romas and Jews that have a memory of a narrative of being a refugee and being persecuted, and the community itself refers to claims that they've suffered around 72, 73 different episodes of violence, which they call Ferman. And so they say they've survived each of these Fermans, these massacres. And so the last of those being 2014. So not only that, there's a very long history of being persecuted, they also have that memory very strongly, and it becomes constitutive of their communal identity, which again has had to, in a way, over these times to survive, very boldly and strongly drove the boundaries of the community away from the other communities whom they saw often as potential threats to the community. So when we talk about this very last experience of being persecuted, 2014, which has been recognized as a genocide by the UN in 2017, we should really think about this intergenerational trauma that they've suffered and preserved the memory of. So in a way, those series of traumas are, on the one hand, is a mechanism of preserving the identity, but it's also a huge trauma that every member of the community has and unfortunately experience live in their lifetime.
How does the situation for Ezidis today compare with that of refugees from other countries? Would you describe the Ezidi diaspora?
So in terms of their experiences, how different? Again, I will have to refer to this memory of being persecuted, memory of the trauma. We know that over time, conversion has been a very serious issue, a serious threat to the community. Assimilation and conversion that goes hand in hand for these communities. So in the Ottoman times, the population of the Yazidis altogether was probably higher than the numbers we have now. And that kind of decrease in numbers, demographic decline, has to do with the political processes. So to protect themselves and preserve the community, what they do is they, again, wherever they go, they try to have a very, again, establish very close knit community with very strict laws of purity, and they used excommunication very often for those who do not follow the rules of the community strictly. So that has been quite an issue, especially for the diasporan Yazidis who left their homelands, not just in the very last attack, but over the years. So if I may speak a little bit about the earlier waves of Yazidi refugeeism, especially after the establishment of the nation states, Yazidis with their ethno-religious identity that's difficult to categorize and box within the identity categories that were created by the nation states, became, stood out as outcast from the very beginning. So we know that in the Iraq and Syrian case, with the start of the Arabization programs, which dates usually, 60s and onwards, Ezidis were particularly targeted. They were either deemed as Kurds or, again, their religion made them a suspicious community for the Arab regimes. And in Turkey, obviously, with a very heavy emphasis on Turkish identity from the very beginning, these communities, again, speaking Kurdish and religiously not Sunni Muslim, again, this was a very suspicious community. Although the regime itself, the state itself, did not do much, they left them to the hands of their Muslim neighbors who would take care of them. So that kind of disempowerment left them really fragile. So what we see in the case of Syria and Iraq, they first moved to the major city centers, and some of them ended up in Europe. In the case of Turkey, they avoided urban centers altogether, and they directly came to Europe and established communities here. And obviously, Germany is one of those countries. Sweden is also another European country that have received a lot of Yazidi populations starting from 1970s onwards. In the case of Turkey, after 1982 coup, there was a very significant exodus of the remaining Yazidi communities. They came and established lives here, but what they did was obviously really pressure the community members to keep their communal boundaries very clear. So obviously over time that created a lot of problems, especially in terms of marriages, in terms of following the purity laws strictly. So they have to loosen some of these principles, but by and large, Yazidis diaspora experience as an diminishing, as an community at the verge of extermination and disappearance have been very painful. Obviously, those in Germany have done a little bit better, especially because they've decided to take some measures that loosened communal boundaries and allow marriages with outside members, at least with people coming from certain religious backgrounds. But still, it has been a struggle to keep the community going. It's been a struggle to put pressure on the community and these rules that allow them to survive for centuries, but also made them very brittle, very fragile when exposed to the outside communities and outside factors.
Could you paint a picture of the refugee journey undertaken by the Yazidis?
I'll start with the last wave, and then perhaps I can talk a little bit about the earlier ones. In the last wave, actually, Shengal, where they were attacked, assaulted in 2014, is one of the most sacred sites of the Yazidis. So it's really the attack, the last assault, was a very successful attack in terms of achieving the goal of extermination. So it's very heartbreaking. So what they did is they referred to their time-honored survival strategies, these communities. They tried to go further up in the mountain to preserve, to save their lives. So it was one of the strategies they used. And the second strategy was to walk back the refugee routes that enabled them to survive the genocidal attack in 1915, ironically. So some of the Yazidis who survived by escaping and walked walk across the borders of Iraq to Turkey, actually came back to their old villages. And the villages that they had to leave in 1915, and moved to Iraq and Syria to establish new lives. And others took it further and try to use Turkey as a point of passage and come to Europe because of that experience of 1915. They claimed they don't feel safe, they don't feel secure starting a life here again, and they don't feel safe to go back and continue with the life they left involuntarily. And some of these people obviously ended up in very different corners of the entire world. Some of them came to Germany, a lot of them came to Germany. Some of them went to Greece in refugee camps, and again, very dramatic stories of Ezidis survivors meeting their persecutors, the people who attacked them. So there are all these very dramatic stories coming out of these experiences. Some of them ending up in Canada, United States, spatially confused, culturally confused. So this has been the experience most recently, and they are trying to start a life wherever they are. But if I were to go back very briefly and maybe compare this very last attack with the previous 71, 72, 73, however you count those earlier Fermas, this last attack was very brutal and was so powerful that it, even according to the UN report, it left no Yazidi untouched. They were either killed, raped, displaced. So it's a community of trauma at this point. So restarting life and using their old survival strategies is at a great tension at this point, because one of the strategies they used in the earlier refugee experiences was to go back, or wherever they are, they could recollect some of the traditions or create new traditions. But, being in Canada, being in the United States, being in different parts of Europe, recollecting those past experiences is not that easy. So in that respect, this very last refugee experience leaves the community with lots of challenges and with lots of questions concerning their communal boundaries, survival at the individual, but also communal level. If I were to go back to earlier experiences of being a refugee and how they utilize those, I actually, in my work, I talk a lot about how in earlier times, despite the persecution, Yazidis could use and manipulate those experiences for survival. And out of these experiences, they came up with survival strategies. So rather than, thinking about Yazidis as victims of all times, I try to see them at a different light as human beings who established life at even the darkest moment of history. So one of the things I look at how they play with the altitude. When at a time when the states, I would use a very problematic term for a historian, but just for the ease of understanding, in the pre-modern states, they could easily inhabit in an high altitude area and avoid contact with agents of the state or communities that can harm them. But with the enhancement of statal capacities, you see that especially in the 19th century, that altitude don't work. I mean, it's unworkable for them. And what you see is they try to go to new locations, like the settlement of Ezidis in the Russian Empire, particularly in today's Armenia, is the result of those persecutions and communities' effort to avoid persecution. So they became permanent communities, and they also developed somewhat a different tradition than, let's say, those who stayed within what will become Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. So there's a very significant Ezidi populations living in Armenia today, and Russia and Armenia today. And most interestingly, actually, Armenia is one of the few countries that recognizes Yazidis as an identity, and they relatively live better off than the rest. So these for the communities in the 19th century, those first efforts to change location or being a refugee was thought to be kind of short-term strategies, but they became permanent. Like what we've seen after 1915 to avoid persecution, Yazidi communities who were actually persecuted alongside with Armenians and Assyrians, and we don't really talk about them because they are so invisible, so muted, and so irrelevant, quote unquote, irrelevant for outside communities, actually went to the other side, went to to Shengal to seek protection. So you see that change of place happens due to obviously an oppression and massacre, and they became refugees, but that also allowed them to develop a kind of recollect themselves and start from scratch. So the challenge at this point is how they are going to recollect, how they are going to perhaps learn from their past experiences, and perhaps they are going to struggle with their past experiences and come up with strategies to re-establish themselves as a community that can survive and not become distinct after such a powerful experience, powerfully destructive experience.
Women and children face particular challenges as refugees. So, how would you characterize the change in experiences of Yazidi women?
Again, it's been very dramatic. I mean, in my work, I try to look at, in my work on the Ottoman period, I try to look into the experiences of Yazidi women. Sometimes come up in the document, not always, sometimes come up in the document. And you see that in terms of what they go through, I would say the difference is a matter of, it's a quantitative difference, not necessarily a qualitative one, unfortunately. So there's stories of rape, kidnapping, but this is all happening, again, within a spatial proximity. So these women are often excommunicated, but they still live within the same kind of spatial landscape. What happened with, again, the attack in 2014 is most of the men were killed on site. That's how we ended up with lots of mass graves. Younger children and women were enslaved and taken away by the members of the militants of ISIS. So that has been a very dramatic experience. One thing that came out of this very destructive and very dramatic experience have been the women with all these horrible and traumatic experiences. There are still women who are missing, and the families are looking for their missing members, daughters, sisters, mothers, and children, and they're found in different locations like Turkey. You know, there are some court cases going on regarding these kidnapped women and children. So they didn't just stay in Iraq or in Syria. So these are very traumatic experiences. But one of the things that happened out of these experiences was the women came out as the representatives, embodiment and representatives of this experience. And with their strength, they told the horrible experiences they suffered, tragedy they suffered at the hands of the militants. They very openly talked about the rape, which again, a communal taboo actually. If you look at the purity laws of the community, they had to be excommunicated and not accepted the community forever. That's the end. But this time, something very interesting happened. They began to speak about their experiences. They broke the silence, both about that what happens to the community if they come under the attack. What does Ferman actually means for the community members? But they also broke the silence that defined the community. They came out as Ezidis and said, this is who we are, and this is how we are treated, how we have been treated, and please hear us. So, for example, Nadia Murad, who's a Nobel Prize laureate, has been the picture of the embodiment of this entire experiences, with the traces of the marks of the trauma she has endured and spoke about very strongly. So they also became the defendant, militarily defendant of the community. Again, this is kind of a community that kept, if I may say, old ways. So the place of the woman had to be confined to a certain place. And for example, the community's relation to education is very complicated. Kind of had to do with religious tradition, but also the conditions in which they had to live in order to survive. So not a very huge rate of literacy. So women emerge as armed to defend remnants of the community, whoever remained of the community. So there are forces, for example, now formed of exclusively of Yazidi women protecting the community. So that's also something very new. But having said that, it's not without contention, it's not without any conflict. One thing I forgot, and I should definitely mention that before I might make my second point. And one of the things that also, one of the interesting that happens out of this experience, the religious hierarchy also very much relaxed the rules of excommunication and reintroduced these women to the tradition by going through a religious ceremony at the holy site of Shengal that had been liberated after removal of ISIS. So they were reintroduced to religion. They received the blessing of the highest Baba of the tradition, and that's a first in the tradition, and that has been a very much welcomed development. But right after this, one complication emerged. What will happen to the children that were born out of rape? And it's a question that happens after every genocidal, after every massacre. I mean, we know that was a huge issue for the Armenian community after 1915. That's been an immensely discussed community issue after the massacres, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. So this happens over and over again, and the decision is hardly ever left to the woman who've gone through these experiences, carried that baby, and took care of it. She can choose to leave the baby, but that's never left to the woman. And actually, something very similar happened to the Ezidi woman most recently. Initially, a decision seemed to be have taken by the religious council to let these children remain with their mothers and be accepted to the community. And right after that, that decision was challenged both by the interventions coming from the diaspora, but also a significant factor that contributed to this decision seems to be Iraq's own legal system, which doesn't allow those children to be registered as Yazidis since they were born out of Muslim fathers. So the Yazidi communities, the members of the community, are concerned that these children are going to be tools, are going to be the venues through which the increasingly Muslim state systems in the Middle East are going to be used to interfere in the communal affairs. And they would never be these children are never going to be fully assimilated into the community because legally they are considered Muslims. So this is a very complicated situation. It's still up for discussion. I mean, some of these children are left to orphanages. Some of those women are accepted into community on the condition that they leave their children. So genocides are never moments. They are never experiences that can be limited to time. It's ongoing processes. And we see that for the Yazidi women particularly, it has a very long-lasting impact in terms of their bodies, in terms of their lives, and in terms of their experiences.
So what is the impact of the loss of Yazidi communities on Middle East and on Iraq, Syria, and Turkey in particular?
I mean, any historian studying the last century of the area that we call very vaguely, loosely as Middle East, can testify to the creation of more and more hegemonic and more homogeneous societies, both in terms of ethnicity and religion. And Yazidis, with their existence, simply by their existence, was kind of a challenge, were seen as a challenge to this process of homogenization that has been going on for a century. It's less diverse, the Middle East is less diverse, less accepting, and I would say more bigot in a way. And this is a very problematic term, I know, and more sectarian as it gets more homogeneous. So we are now talking about predominantly Muslim Middle East, something that you could not have imagined a century ago. And we are more talking about huge territories of ethnic, more or less concentration. I wouldn't say purity, but concentration, which again leaves even less room for survival. So this is not to say that we should be talking about Yazidis for the plurality, but we should definitely consider that as Yazidis go away with their horrible experiences, what they leave behind is a less livable Middle East.
Zeynep, how did you become interested in this topic?
During my dissertation research, I decided to work on what I call at that time heterodox communities of the empire. So what I had in mind was to work on Kızılbaş, Alevi, and Nusayri Alevi communities. Later on, crypto-Christians of Pontus and Ezidis were added to my list. So I look at the religious experiences of these communities, religious mobilization that were taking place as part of reforms taking place in the Ottoman Empire in the long 19th century. So that I look at basically after 1839 onwards and try to see how these communities presented themselves, how they were perceived, and what kind of mechanisms were developed by the Ottoman state to deal with these communities. So one of the things that I noticed and horrified over and over is that Yazidis were one of the communities out of these four, and each of these communities have a memory of being persecuted by the Ottoman center. Actually, was the one community that was repeatedly subjected to forced conversion, mass persecution, beheadings and attacks by the Ottoman center, particularly the second half of the 19th century, the reform period, was very traumatic and was full of episodes of violence. So that's how I included, actually, reading about their experiences at the Ottoman archives. I became interested in the community, and I tried to understand how they dealt with these experiences of violence. What did they do with their religious traditions, especially after the arrival of the American missionaries to the region, which hoped to convert Yazidis like any other community that they came across with at the time. So that has been my story. But it took a while for me to actually start working on them, because even for a historian who doesn't have necessarily, a communal relation, I'm not a member of the community in terms of my self-identification. It's a very traumatic experience just to work with this document, let alone go through them. So in my mind, when I frame the experiences of these communities, I put the crypto-Christians and their experiences, as they claim themselves to be Christians after the Reform Edict of 1856, as a very bold statement, and by and large avoiding persecution on the one side of the spectrum, and the experiences of Ezidis, who were subjected to, again, several episodes of violence on the other extreme and on other side of the experience. And I try to understand why and how Ezidis were repeatedly had to go through this experience. So that has been the question I had in mind when I studying this issue.
Could you tell us something about the kinds of research methods and materials that you use in your research?
I'm a historian, conventional historian in many respects, so I like working with the documents, and I like talking about documents. So one of the challenges to work with these documents as a historians is, and I, if I were to say a little bit about my documents, I mostly, in terms of, for Yazidis, I work with missionary and Ottoman state documents, to an extent British and American archives. The difficulty is that these communities try to avoid contact with what quote unquote state, and bureaucrats hardly want to hear their narratives. So it's very hard to hear the voices of these communities. What you hear is a narrative that came out, I call it in prose, that comes out of Ottoman bureaucracy or American missionaries, but their voices are often mediated through these agents. So I try to, letting these documents speak to each other, I try to hear the voices of these communities. I try to be another mediator to bring the voices of these communities as much as I can here through these documents to today, and try to present or try to construct a story from where they stood as they were going through these experiences. So that has been my main concern, my political statement, and my academic position for this community.
What role can scholars play in drawing the world's attention to the plight of Ezidis?
So when all this attack started, very few people outside of the community knew anything about them. So several, I mean, I shouldn't say several, but there are a number of scholars who were invited to talk about this issue. So they were the ones to say a few words, tell them who these people were and come up with an explanation for why they were going through this experience. So that has been the main thing. In terms of my own work, as I just summarized, I try to reconstruct their position and tell their experiences of an earlier flight, and hope that would be perhaps a way to understand their current experiences. But there were other scholars who've been very influential in both making their experiences known and also help rehabilitate. And I should mention the name of I say psychiatrist here based in Germany, Can İlhan Kızılhan, who actually is member of the community himself and established a rehabilitation center for the Yazidi women and children in Baden-Württemberg. And Nadia Murad actually is one of the women who've gone through this center and has been very vocal about her experiences. So yes, people in social sciences have been did their best, but I think there were other fields, applied fields, that help these people recuperate and come up with kind of solutions to deal with such a huge trauma. So I should definitely mention him as an important figure. And he's actually now doing work also in Duhok, helping community educate their own trauma specialist so that they'll have access to these kind of services on the ground. And I think it's extremely important to have those kind of links between academia and people on the ground for a community of this scale and these experiences.
What are the future prospects for Yazidi communities, do you think? Will Yazidis be able to return to their ancestral homelands?
That's an issue that a community is trying to answer. But there are several challenges on the ground. First of all, they very openly say they lost trust and they don't want to go through this experience again. And they openly say that they don't want to live in a Muslim society. And with Muslim society, I guess there are several ways to approach this. I mean, they don't want to live in a state where openly or tacitly Islamic principles are used. And here, I think one of the lessons that's learned hard, I mean, academics talk about this, but in terms of the implications of this for the people going through these experiences is the failure of the secularism or the huge discrepancy between the promises of secularism, secular citizenship in the Middle East. And here I have in mind Turkey, Syria, Iraq, who all had their phases of very, staunchly secular stages, and none of these were able to actually deliver equal citizenship to these communities. So in that respect, when they mention that they don't want to live in a Muslim society, they also have in mind those periods of secular experiences, that those kind of state structures openly or with their tacit structures still continue to target these groups or fail to provide protection to them. So that's one of the challenges. Obviously, the conflict is ongoing. It's not cleared. So especially with the recent extension of the Turkish backed occupation of northern Syria once again, the last remaining Yazidi villages that had not come under the attack of ISIS is now came under the attack of these groups that are named as Free Syrian Army, affiliates of Free Syrian Army or whatever, with all their different names. So these communities are also coming under attack. So the prospects on the ground is not very bright. It's very gloomy. There's too many uncertainties for these people to say, okay, it's over and we are going to go back and establish a new life. But there also, I guess, several members of the community voice their concern is their sacred sites and holy sites are there. So this has been an ongoing discussion, but we know that actually the numbers of return are very low, extremely low. So whether they'll be able to overcome this and go back, we'll see probably in the coming decades. But unfortunately, we can't give a clear answer. And what we see on the ground is that prospects of new trauma seems more probable than prospects of regenerating and somewhat new life. So there are several NGOs and community initiatives that tries to encourage a return, but I guess they are not reassuring enough for the community members to take such bold moves and feel safe and secure back in their homes again.
Zeynep, thank you so much for your very valuable input and your reflections on the issue. Thank you so much again for joining us.